and welcome back to Knits by Lizzie. My name is Lizzie and this is my channel where I talk about all things knitting. Today we're going to go over 10 hood patterns that you can knit this winter to stay warm, and we're going to go over 9 paid patterns, and then the last pattern I'm going to discuss is a free pattern. And we've got a pretty good range of hood patterns to talk about today. Some of them have full scarves attached to them, some of them are a cowl or a short scarf, and then there's also a few hood patterns that are just hoods that you can pair with a coat to make a non-hooded coat. All of a sudden have a hood to keep you warm. I was inspired to make this video for you guys because I recently cast on my first hood pattern that I'm knitting for my younger sister for her birthday, and I do think that there is a bit of a trend going on right now for hoods in general, and obviously winter is the perfect time to make a hood pattern. Here in New Hampshire we are truly in deep winter. There's been a ton of snow and it's been super cold, and it's the perfect time to have a hood to throw on when you need not only just a scarf but also something that like really encapsulates you. And then also I do think that hoods can be easier to put on if you have like your hair done in a certain way that you like. For example, instead of having to pull on a hat over your head, you can wrap a hood around you and maybe mess up your hair not as much. Since I have recently started my first hood project, I thought I would bring some inspiration to all of you in case you were looking to knit a hood this winter as well. And so if that interests you at all, please feel free to grab your own project and hang out with us as we chat about some hood patterns. So the first hood pattern I'm going to go over today is the one that I just cast on, and it is the My Jose Hood by NORgard Knitters. And this is one of those hood patterns that is a hood and scarf combo, and so it is in all over garter stitch with a large hood that expands out to have a scarf that you can wrap around yourself multiple times, and then at the very end it's finished with I-cord ties so that you can tie the hood around your neck, and then the I-cord finishes go all the way around the hood. This pattern is $8.70 on Ravelry and uses an Aran weight yarn on 5mm needles. I'm knitting mine out of a sport weight yarn, and so I'm fiddling a little bit with the gauge, but the pattern calls for an Aran weight yarn, and so the amount of yarn suggested for this pattern, which only has one size, is 630 meters of yarn. And today I really tried to make sure that I recorded how much yarn each of these hoods took, because I think that accessories are really good for stash busters, and so you can listen to all of these hood patterns and maybe find one that fits into a certain quantity of yarn that you have left in your stash that you want to use up. So if you have something that's 630 meters, the My Jose Hood would be really good for that. This hood is knit from the top down, and so what you do is you knit like a square, which is the top of the hood, and then you just increase out to create the hood. And so you're increasing on both sides at the same time and then finishing with I-cord. My plan for my project is to modify it, and instead of doing I-cord ties at the end, I actually have a cute big button that I want to finish this hood scarf thing with, and so my plan is to add a couple buttonholes and then one button so that my sister can button it, but the pattern calls for I-cord ties. A similar pattern that is available now that is also a garter stitch hood that is a big hood and a long scarf attached to it is the Sophie Hood by Petite Knit, and this is part of her Sophie pattern sequence. So she has a Sophie shawl and a Sophie scarf that are all garter stitch with I-cord edging, and so this Sophie Hood is no different. So it is garter stitch and I-cord edging all around it. This hood I think looks very similar to the My Jose Hood, but the construction is a bit differently. It says in the pattern page that it's knit tip to tip, which is the way that the Sophie shawl is knit, and I believe the Sophie scarf is knit that way as well. And so you are casting on very, very small, you increase, and then you must do the hood at that point, and then I think you decrease down on the other side. And so you could figure out how to use the exact amount of yarn that you have in stash by just weighing your yarn, knitting until you have half of it left, and then knitting down. However, you might have to fiddle a little bit with that to make sure that your the actual hood part is the right size. But definitely that is something that people do often with the Sophie shawl, where they just knit into the halfway point of their yarn and then increase up to that point, and then once they're at the halfway point you can decrease down. This pattern is $5.08 on Ravelry, and it comes in 3 different sizes. It is knit on 5mm needles, again in garter stitch with an Aran weight yarn, and it uses 400 to 600 660 meters of yarn. And so it is, again, very similar to the My Jose hood, but I think the biggest difference is that you get, I think, skinnier scarf sections at the end, and then also the Sophie hood is not finished with I-cord ties the way that the My Jose hood is finished. So another hood pattern that is a scarf hood combo is the Espresso Hood by Katarina Linnhagen, and this is an all brioche hood scarf combo that, just like the Sophie hood, is knit from tip to tip, where you're gonna cast on very small and then increase, make the hood and then decrease, but in brioche. And so this, I think, will make a super warm and squishy garment because of that brioche stitch. This one, just like the Sophie hood and the My Jose hood, is also finished with I-cord edges around it, and it comes in 2 sizes. This pattern also calls for an air weight gauge, but is knit on 4.5mm needles, and it will use 500 to 600 meters of yarn. Again, I think that this would really create a super duper warm, squishy, fun project and garment in the end. And this pattern is $6.66 on Ravelry. So now I'm gonna move into a few hood patterns that you could knit if you didn't want a huge scarf at the end, but you still wanted some scarf and neck covering, but just a smaller amount of it. And so we've got one pattern here that is a cowl at the end, and then another pattern that is still a scarf at the end, but just a much smaller version. The hood pattern that is a combo of a hood with a cowl is called Hoodola, a basic hooded cowl. And this pattern is by Nelkin, and it is $6 on Ravelry, and is a stockinette hood and then a 2x2 ribbed cowl on the end of it. And of course, you could choose to make your cowl really long or really short, depending on what you're trying to fit into your wardrobe or what your preferences are. And so this hood is knit top down, and so you start knitting flat to make the hood in stockinette, and then you join in the round and knit 2x2 ribbing for the cowl. This pattern calls for 4.5mm needles and DK weight yarn, and you would use about 360 yards of DK weight yarn for this project. So I think this would be really good if you had like 1 or 2 skeins of DK weight yarn in your stash, or like a skein and a half. This would be perfect. Again, these are all, I think, really good stash busters where they are using, in general, less than a whole sweater's quantity worth of yarn. And so if you're anything like me and overbuy yarn all the time, I'm really bad at estimating how much I need. I have a lot of kind of odd volumes of yarn left in my stash, and it's really hard for me to find out what to do with it. And so I think that 360 yards is kind of one of those odd amounts that making this hooded cowl, I think, would be a perfect use of yarn. And I also think it's good for gifts. Like, for example, I'm making the hood pattern that I'm making, I'm using leftover stash yarn and I'm giving it as a gift. So I really think that that is a good use for these patterns. Another hood pattern that is a much smaller scarf is the Alex Hood by Pernille Larsen, who is the designer for Knitting for Olive. This pattern is $5.08 on Ravelry, and the whole thing is in 2x2 ribbing. And so you have a 2x2 ribbed hood and then a small scarf at the end. The construction of this hood is a little bit different, and so it is kind of like it's knit tip to tip, but not quite. And so what it says in the pattern page is that you actually knit the first side of the scarf, and then you knit separately the other side of the scarf, and then you graft those together, and then you must pick up stitches or something to add the hood on top of that. This pattern calls for 3.5mm needles and uses 750 meters of yarn. The gauge on this, if I remember correctly, was pretty small. I think just because of DK weight yarn and 3.5mm needles in the 2x2 ribbing, that's kind of gonna cinch it in. So I think that's why you're using so much yarn for this. So I think that this pattern would be really good if you kind of wanted that same look as the hood and huge scarves, but you didn't need so much fabric around your neck, or maybe you didn't like that, or if your coat can't like accommodate a bunch of fabric coming out of it. I think the Alex Hood would probably be a good way to go. So finally, the last section of paid patterns is hoods that have no cowl or scarf or large scarf associated with them. I do think that if you really liked a lot of these hood patterns that I'm about to discuss, but you wanted them to have a scarf element, one thing you could do is knit the bottom part of it just longer and kind of turn it into a cowl. And so then you would have more fabric around your neck to keep you warm. And so then I think you could kind of turn these only hood patterns into a hood scarf combo if you wanted. But the way that they're designed is just as hood only patterns. And I have 4 patterns to tell you about, and they are from 2 different designers. So 2 different designers have 2 different hood patterns that I'm gonna go over. And so the first designer is Cheryl, who has 2 basic hood patterns, and I've actually knit one of her patterns before. I knit a t-shirt pattern from her this past summer. It was the Seaside Tee. I really liked that pattern and her writing style, and so I think Cheryl Mokhtari is a good designer. And so she's got 2 hood patterns, and one of them is the Hebrides Hood, again by Cheryl Mokhtari. This pattern is $5.86 on Ravelry, and it is a very basic, just stockinette hood pattern, and then it's finished by 1x1 ribbing. And so I think probably of all of these patterns, this one is the most basic, the most beginner friendly. This one is knit top down, and again, it is just a hood with no scarf attached. It calls for 5mm needles and a worsted weight yarn, and it uses about 300 meters of yarn. So I do think that this is just a really basic, a really great basic hood pattern that can turn any sort of sweater into a sweatshirt or add a hood to a coat that doesn't have a hood. I really think that it's pretty versatile. Cheryl Mokhtari has another hood pattern that is just a hood with no scarf. However, it's a little less basic. She also has one that is in all over half fisherman's rib, which make it really, really nice and squishy. And so this is the Hebrides Hood by Cheryl Mokhtari. And again, just a hood covering and no scarf in half fisherman's rib. This pattern is also $5.86 on Ravelry. And just like the Hebrides Hood, it is finished in 1x1 ribbing. This pattern calls for worsted weight yarn on 4.5mm needles and uses about 375 meters of yarn. And so I do think that these just hood only patterns are good for when you've got slightly less stash yarn that you're gonna use up. For example, this one again is for worsted weight yarn. That may be like 2 skeins of yarn for 375 meters. Also like the Hebrides Hood, this half fisherman's ribbed version is knit top down as well. The other designer that I'm going to discuss 2 patterns from is Veronica Lindberg, who is also known as Katova Kika on YouTube and Instagram. I am confident that many of you have heard of her. She is the designer for the Stripe Hype sweater, which definitely had its moment. I have knit several of her patterns. The main one that comes to mind for me is the Arctic Light sweater that I have knit 2 of that I absolutely loved. I actually also own her very first book that she published. I have an ebook version of it, and I absolutely adore her writing style. I think it's super duper clear. I really like all of her designs, and so I really cannot recommend her enough. So much so that I'm going to tell you about 2 of her hood patterns. So again, these are just hoods with no real scarf or cowl at the end, but these are definitely not basic. They are lace and cowl. And so the first pattern that I'm going to go over is the Grandmacore Hood by Veronica Lindberg. So this is an all over lace hood that is, I think, just so beautiful. I really think that it could just add a fun element to any sort of winter outfit, especially when I personally in winter get really just tired of wearing coats over every outfit that I make. It can get kind of old just to have the same coat on all the time, and so throwing a really fun hood on top that is lace or a really fun color or something is a really just fun way to play with outfits in the winter. This pattern is $5.30 on Ravelry and calls for 4mm needles and DK weight yarn. It uses about 500 meters of yarn to knit this, and it has this kind of leaf looking lace motif all over it. It also looks like it has some I-cord ties that go around it, and so you can kind of cinch it in around your face to keep you super duper warm and have no cold wind getting anywhere. And so I think that is super great. This pattern is also knit top down. Another really fun hood pattern from Veronica Lindberg is the Cozy Coco Hood. And so instead of lace, this fun hood is knit in honeycomb cables all over it to give a really cool texture. Again, this one is just a hood with no scarf at the end. This hood is finished with double knitting all the way around and has a decorative double knitted ties at the end that you can tie into a bow. However, the pattern does not use those ties to cinch it around your neck. Instead, it is actually opened at the bottom, and you put some buttons, a like snap button, or you could do whatever kind of button you want, but it's closed with buttons instead of being something that you pull over your head. You can kind of set it on your head and then close it. Again, it would be really good for dealing with your hair. If you have it a certain way, you're less likely to mess it up by pulling something over your head, and so I think this pattern would be super great for that. And so I think that's a really nice touch, and I do think that the double knitted edges look super clean. I personally love double knitting everywhere. I often add double knitted button bands onto cardigans when they call for ribbed ones because I love them so much. Double knitting does take a bit of time, but I found when I have done it, I really prepared myself for it to take ages and ages and ages, and maybe because I had that sort of expectation, I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't take as long as I was expecting. It's definitely more time than one by one ribbing edging, but I think it's definitely worth it. You get a really nice, squishy, clean finish when you do double knitting. This pattern also calls for DK weight yarn, but it's knit on 4.5mm needles, and it uses about 330 meters of yarn. The final pattern that I'm going to discuss today is a free pattern, and this pattern was designed for Purl Soho. This is the Hood Scarf by Lily Tobias, and it is free, and so on Ravelry, if you click the free link, what it does is it brings you to the Purl Soho webpage, and then you can read the pattern from there. This is a hood that also has a scarf attached to it, and it looks about like a medium-sized scarf, and so I do think that it would keep you pretty warm, and it is in all over 2x2 ribbing, and it is knit from tip to tip, where you're gonna knit 2x2 ribbing long and skinny and increase, and then make a hood, and then decrease to make the second half of the scarf, all over 2x2 ribbing. This pattern actually comes in 2 different sizes, so it has an extra small / small size and a medium / large size, all designed for adults. And this pattern uses 3.5mm needles and sport weight yarn, which you don't see very often for patterns. So it uses sport weight yarn, and of course it suggests a Purl Soho yarn, but of course you can use whatever sport weight yarn you'd like. This pattern calls for 775 yards to 905 yards of yarn, and so it's on the bigger side of yarn consumption for these hoods here, but I think it is a nice free resource if you would like to knit a hood. So that brings us to the end of the 10 hood patterns that I had to share with you guys. I hope you had just as much fun as I did going through all of these hood patterns. I am really enjoying making my very first hood, and I hope that this video inspires and encourages you to cast on your first or second or multiple hood pattern this winter. I think that they can be a really versatile accessory in your wardrobe, your winter wardrobe, and can really either brighten things up. You can use them to add a pop of color. You could do the lace or fun cabled versions, or the brioche or half fisherman's ribbed versions to get something really squishy and warm. Yeah, I think the possibilities are endless, especially with all of these different types of hoods that are out there. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up. That helps it find more viewers like you. And if you want to see more knitting content from me, feel free to subscribe. I mainly upload knitting podcasts on this channel, but every now and then I like to venture into looking at some patterns or reviewing my knits or things like that. So I would love if you would hang out with us more often and subscribe. So with that, that brings us to the end, and so I'm gonna send lots of big hugs to everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye!